So yeah, it's an interesting question because you can look at it in two ways. Either a watch that is in the market and is undervalued, underappreciated, but is yet to go up and will go up, or you can look at it as something which is in the market, undervalued, underappreciated, and will remain a great bargain because for a variety of reasons, it will just never be in favour. And I think my selection for the first would probably be Breitling. It's exciting times for Breitling. I think they have an amazing back catalogue, interesting use of movements. Obviously, we've got some values in there which have done great things for Rolex. They're doing great things for Hoya. Why shouldn't they do great things for Breitling? We also have a change of direction possibly under their new owner, and he may make more of the back catalogue than the brand currently does.
Changing the chairman, aren't they?
Yes, so I think there's an opportunity to do a little bit of investigation of the heritage, probably bring back some slightly more refined pieces, maybe a nice duograph, maybe a revisit to the Co-Pilot.
The duograph, they made it 3 times. They made the same version, the same name, but 3 different watches. So the first one was the split seconds.
Yes, that's the one I was meaning.
Exactly. Yes, but I was talking to them once, and they asked me what's your favourite Breitling, and I said, oh, the duograph, and they looked at me like I was completely mad. It's like, really? And of course they were thinking of the one that they brought out in the 80s, rather than the split seconds.
Yes, but of course, looking at the other side of it, what is undervalued, underappreciated, but probably will never change. My choice for that would be vintage Piaget. Essentially, you can buy a manual wind ultra slim Piaget for barely more than the weight of its gold, which is a crime. Unless, of course, you're in the market for one, which is fantastic. Because it's a beautiful movement, it's reliable movement, and you just have to live with something that's probably not going to be more than 34 mil wide. But for an evening dress watch, for even sort of £700–800, you can lay your hands on a fantastic watch. Yeah. And I can't see that the needle is going to swing back far enough to allow 34 mil watches to really shine again. So always be a bargain.
I think there's I mean that's the Piaget in particular. I think that's a very interesting point because actually they are ridiculously cheap at the moment, and for what they are.
And funky hard stone dials from the 70s.
Absolutely, 100% agree. But there's, I guess, so a year ago I would have said something like something really standard like an Ennecar Sherpa graph, because everyone seemed to want those as more accessible vintage sports watches with a certain kind of flair and design. Actually, I would say 2 particular brands that I would focus on, very mainstream, not at all niche, already relatively expensive in some cases, but that have quite a long way to go, I think, are Tudor and AP. So Tudor, obviously because over the last few years we've seen a real change of approach with the sort of the direction of the company and what they're bringing out. They seem to have had a number of very successful executions, and so actually that's galvanized, I think, a lot of interest at an entry level amongst collectors. It suddenly created a load of people who otherwise might have shied towards Rolex or Omega, thinking, you know what, I'd like to buy a brand new Tudor, and obviously that then eventually turns
it's kind of younger, cooler cousin, not younger, cheaper cousin.
No, absolutely. That's exactly it. They positioned it very, very, very smartly. That then turns into people who, down the line, probably want to get the earlier vintage pieces. AP, I was just thinking about it the other day. You look at the Nautilus from Patek, and the early Nautiluses, of course, they're just skyrocketing in value. Actually, what's slightly lagging behind, but pretty much the same bang for your buck, a Gerald Genta designed iconic early sports watch that is fantastically made and later obviously has resulted in some fantastic new designs and executions and later models, are the early Royal Oak pieces. I think when you look at the A series and then the B series and the C series, limited numbers, some of them are literally numbered on the case back. I think they still have a long way to go in terms of catching up with market value.
I think size is a problem there.
Because they're too small,
yes,
relative to,
yeah.
well, I don't know. I mean, I confess I have an A series AP, so I'm not objective, but I actually I'm probably going to sell it at some point in the future, because I don't personally wear it often enough because I'm so careful about the bezel. But personally, I have a relatively maybe slim to average wrist. I think it's 38 millimeter from recollection. I could be wrong, maybe it's 40, but it feels perfect for me. And given that the market is now shifting more towards smaller rather than bigger watches, that's probably.
And if you're producing something that is sports and dress,
yeah, perfect.
38 millimeters.
Win-win.
38 is good. Yeah. No. Yeah. I'm more inclined towards complications, because I think you've got some amazing complications by undervalued makers. I mean, Breitling, a good example. You can get a triple calendar from Breitling, good size, 38 mil, sometimes a little 39. You can also get them smaller as well, but they're really things that I think should be looked at more. And I think they've got an awfully long way to go, and I think it's one of those things that could catch fire quite quickly.
There's a lot of choice in that triple calendar, and even triple calendar chronos.
And you have those fantastic dials as well. You've got sort of gilt printing and silver printing, and all sorts of choices of the fonts, and so it's a really open market. And just at the moment, it's very much undervalued.
What about Angelus?
Angelus, that's an interesting,
that sort of kettle of fish.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. But they made some great chronographs with fantastic pieces. So and you've got other brands like Zodiac, for example. And Zodiac, of course, was made by Hoya. So it's one of those things that you're buying a Hoya watch, but because nobody knows Zodiac, then you're buying it for a tenth of the value.
Fantastic military provenance with the Vietnam War issue pieces.
Yeah.
The Sea Wolves.
I didn't know there were any Vietnam War issued.
The Sea Wolves,
wow.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Tended to leak, tended to get swapped out for a Seiko, but very, very cool, and for the vintage diver area, which is very popular. I think Zodiac. I think they've just been bought by Fossil.
Ah, have they?
And they produced some retro-looking chronos at the Sea Dragon range. So they're trying to pull some vintage cues into their modern work,
which will always help the market.
But I think there's a big story to tell with Zodiac. And of course, you've got the 70s astrographic, which is one of those ridiculously funky pieces with the wandering red dot seconds. If you haven't seen one,
I haven't seen one. No, I'm going to go search it.
They came in wonderful oval UFO cases or rectangular cases, and it was like a mystery watch. So you didn't see the hands; they were literally marked onto crystals with a wandering dot. So yes, but they're high beat movements.
Wow.
They're the SSTs. So yeah, they were seen as being super accurate for the time, and worth looking at if you like a bit of retro.
I do.
So I think the fact that the Caliber 89 from Patek didn't sell recently was a crying shame, considering its historical importance and considering what it represented from a sort of technical point of view. It probably, speaks more to a sale that could have been perhaps a little bit better handled. I think that there probably should have been more people in the room ready to bid, rather than it sort of petering out the way it did. But I think those sorts of sales are perhaps anomalous in the broader context, because you are talking about a huge amount of money for a pocket watch, of which I think, did they make 4 or 3?
Made 4 on a prototype.
4 on a prototype. Yeah. So it is. There are quite a lot of them, quote unquote, for what they are, exceptionally important pocket watches. So whilst the more general trend is, a strong market, you're always going to have hiccups and unusual things, and obviously, there is a question around pocket watches. There's still a question around.
Let's be honest, you can't strap it on your wrist and impress your friends.
No, I mean, look at the recent sale at Sotheby's for the English watches. wasn't a strong result.
I think it's the person who collects the pocket watch is a sophisticated collector in a different way to the sophistication of a high-end wristwatch, and as you say, maybe more interested in the historical aspect to it rather than essentially, it's showing off in some ways. At the top end of collecting, it's adding prizes, bagging these things that nobody else has, which just require the deepest pockets. And maybe with newer money coming into the market, there's a less of an understanding of what makes the pocket watch important as a precursor technologically to what we're wearing on our wrists.
But I think that begs the question, doesn't it? That what is driving the market? I mean, the Caliber 89's got to be, the person who's going to buy that is going to be somebody who's after the best of the best. There isn't another one. They're all in different colours. They're all individual. I think the fact that it had been known about and had been on the market, had been at Christie's before, then it was at Sotheby's. So the whole watch was a little bit
tainted.
Yeah, tainted. Yeah, I suppose that is kind of the word. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't something. Oh wow, it's appeared for the first time. It's great. We can finally get our hands on it, because it had been offered around. I think it had a price, but just not the price that it was set at. And I still think, and I don't know. Does anybody know whether it sold after the sale?
I don't. But what did they start the bidding at? Was it like something crazy?
I think it was 4.5.
4.5.
Yeah.
2.5. It was, anyway, I thought it was, yeah.
Yeah, well, it should have climbed up there. It should have been, there should have been vested interest to make it sell. But as you say, it's a pocket watch. You have it on your desk in your office or something. It's more of a work of art than it is something that.
It's not even a wearable pocket watch.
Not even.
Should you want to put on a waistcoat and use one, you're not going to use that.
No. What is it? 88 millimeters, I think, something like that. Huge. Yeah, it's very big. Yeah.
But the only strange thing, I guess, is my impression is from what I'm hearing that the Chinese market, the Chinese collecting market, is starting to become really quite actively interested in pocket watches, in early pocket watches. I haven't seen it personally, so I'm only talking about hearsay, but I've been told that there's a lot of growth in that sort of that early early stage interest in non-wristwatches. But perhaps we haven't reached a point that it's sufficiently developed to justify that kind of acquisition.
I think the Chinese have always been very interested in the decorative watches, the enamel watches. The Asian market has always been very strong for those, even in the past, Hong Kong especially. So it doesn't surprise me that they're now moving over to earlier pieces. It's a market that should be doing a little better than it is, certainly.
But I think you have to come back to its usability, and I know people are going to buy a lot of these, very rare Pateks, very rare Rolexes, and maybe not take them out that often. But when they do, they can wear them and show them off in a way that you can't quite do with a pocket watch. Well, if I pick this up at the bottom end, if you like, and there is an enormous amount of fun to be had, for want of a word, at the shallow end, which is great because there's very little risk, but you can still start to pick up some really interesting things. One of my personal interests is vintage Seiko, if you're looking at Seikos from the 70s, and in terms of credibility, it's one of the three competitors for first automatic chronograph. You've got your speed timers, 6139s, enormous amount of choice of dials, sadly starting to suffer from the same aftermarket replacement part issues as a lot of other areas, so do your research. But for £200, £300, £400 you're starting to get something which is a very wearable size, great functions, looks cool, and doesn't cost you an awful lot of money. If it has to be Swiss, then you can get some great early Tissot's, which you may be looking at starting to get into chronographs, you may get into world timers, and a lot of those share the same calibers as their grander cousins in Longines and Omega, so you've got a great engine behind them, and you know, it's a great place to start. But I think if you were starting to maybe splash out £500 upwards, you can't really go wrong with something like an Omega Constellation, 50s and 60s, fantastic movement, especially if you can get something like a Paipan dial in a stainless steel case, great condition. You're looking at sub £1,000, you're not going to lose a penny on it when you start to resell it, but why would you resell it? It's a classic design that's going to last you.
Well, I'd be more generic in my answer and say go for something that you're going to enjoy and love. Do your research, find out what it is, what the background behind it is, but wear something that, or buy something that you can wear and really enjoy it. And if at the end of it you make a profit or break even, then you've done well. But the most important thing is to get something that's your style. And there are so many pieces out there. And we're talking about the Omegas, the Longines, the Tissots. There are many marks many brands that are very much on that end, where they made lots of series pieces that are definitely worth looking at.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly sort of robust sort of description of the right approach to take. I think you know, if you're looking for something that's pretty much as safe as houses, but it's still an investment, and you want something that's going to be iconic, and a lot of people are probably going to recognize, which, let's be honest, it does play an important role in people's sort of thinking about what to buy. I would go for something like an entry-level vintage Rolex Submariner, maybe a 5513 without date, just because you can get something that has all the charm of a great vintage watch, but has the iconic design of a fantastically industrially produced watch, that's, you know, has the patina that says it's had a life well lived, and you know, you're looking at something around £5,000 to £5,500 for something that may not have box and papers. You might be lucky, you know, you can pick something up with papers, but it probably, in every other sense, will be correct. Bar perhaps a replacement bezel insert. You're going to have a nice dial, you're going to have the correct bracelet and end links, and it won't have been hopefully too polished, and then it's easy to service, which, you know, does play an important part in sort of any decision about what to buy. You know, you can buy an affordable piece at any level, but you do have to think about, well, is it going to cost me more than the value of the watch when I come to service it if it goes wrong? With a Rolex, it's a relatively sort of, you know, standard thing, and as long as it's functioning reasonably well when you pick it up, then it's unlikely to go far wrong in the first few years. And
I think that's service is actually an overlooked part of collecting and keeping these things running, which may on the face of it look like a bargain. Finding someone who will take on a rare and esoteric, possibly cheap movement for which parts aren't available.
And they're difficult to repair because they were cheaply made. So
that's definitely worth thinking about.
I think you both. I mean, the condition is something that needs to be looked at carefully, and the best condition that you can possibly get is obviously going to put you in a better place in the market and for reselling afterwards.
I think it's tricky because obviously the logic of building a watch with the latest materials, the latest composites, with the most scratch and damage resistant properties, naturally means that the watch over time is going to be less subject to the change that brought around by the elements and the environment that they're sort of exposed to, than, you know, the historic pieces that many of us, you know, look at every day. So that will have an impact inevitably, but then probably what we'll see is something of a deliberate attempt to either design those watches in these great materials to look more and more vintage-like, so that you kind of skip that whole process and get straight to a vintage-inspired piece, or we'll see people deliberately modifying their watches to try and render them, you know, more patinated.
But in some ways, if you look at what makes the most money, it is the new old stock unaged. It's just that we have to make judgments about whether aging and patina is attractive, because it's part of the process. But when you find that never been out of its box, never been out of the safe in the retailer, sharp case, black dial, never been in the sun, that is incredibly rare and therefore makes incredibly good money. So in some ways what we're aspiring to is that perfection in our old pieces, because it is rare. So what we're going to have is more accessible perfection in on our newer watches. But I think scarcity is going to be a problem, because obviously it's that scarcity of perfection which drives the price, but also scarcity of production. Whereas the sheer number of watches that are being produced across all the reference, across all the brands now is staggering. They are not rare. And even when they put artificial means such as limited editions, are limited editions going to be sought after in 20, 30, 40 years? I suspect most limited editions are nonsense, unless they actually offer a limited run of production of a particular movement, and that is it. We will not produce it anymore, which then raises questions of servicing and tooling. Why would you pay more just to have a blue dial or a particular date engraved on the back? I suspect that it is driving sales now, but it will not drive the collector's market in 20, 30 years down the line.
But then if you take that point of view, then things like red submariners and double red submariners, where it is literally, it's a limited edition by its nature. They didn't produce that many, but it is exactly as you're saying, just a small tiny feature of what is a standard watch that is different. So the market is there. I kind of agree that
it's the organic production of a limited series, as opposed to the cynical numbered series, boutique edition.
Agreed.
We've just produced a blue one or a DLC one or whatever it might be.
I think you can look at the parallels in the ceramics market, where they did exactly that. They produced limited production and then destroyed the molds. And yes, as you say, it drove the market at the time to sell them, but the collectors afterwards were not that impressed with the limited 2,500 or whatever it was. So, but the condition of the future, in the future, I think again, when you're talking about the new old stock, that's the ultimate dream. You come across something that is an ultra rare watch and it is new old stock. But then you do actually have already in the marketplace things that don't change. Things like the Patek Philippe 2526 with the enamel dial. That doesn't do, okay, cracks, but it's not going to age at all. You know, in 300 years' time, that dial will look exactly as it does today. And there's a certain appeal to that. So maybe that appeal will carry over into the ceramic bezels and the dials that don't fade because they're made not to fade.
My only sort of concern or caveat with that, I guess, is, well, obviously today we're talking about increasingly industrial scale-esque production of certain watches by certain watch companies. And obviously, you know, the limited editions go from being 50 to 700 or 1300, and you know, there's obviously a question mark around whether that truly is a limited edition in that sense, just simply by the sheer volume of pieces that were made, not whether they break the cast or make no more. But you know, I sort of, if so many more pieces are being made today, and so many more pieces were made 10 years ago than 20 years ago, and continuing backwards, I wonder whether we're not slightly setting ourselves up to fall, in the sense that in 20 or 30 years' time, the presence of such a vast number of industrially produced quote-unquote watches means that it'll be a lot harder to convince people, to sort of put it slightly, you know, devil's advocate, to convince people that those are collectible watches in the same sense as an early Rolex or an early Patek or a Grand Complication. Obviously, there's always going to be a number of pieces that are just ultimately exceptionally rare. But in a broader sense, from the big brands, I think we're going to struggle in 20 or 30 years to justify the same sort of level of hype around pieces that were made 10 years ago.
I mean, it's the whole problem of trying to define a classic of the future, because in 30 years' time, will people still want a 1950s Rolex sub?
Yeah.
They will. It'll just be older and rarer and more valuable.
Yeah.
They're not producing any more 1950s pieces. That is the key. And yes, we will have pieces from the turn of this century, which will now be 30-year-old pieces, but people will still lust after the originals, and vintage is not going anywhere, and I don't see that the modern will become vintage in the same way, because they're largely produced as luxury aspirational pieces, not tools. You can say it's a tool watch if we're talking about a Rolex sports piece, but how often is it used as a tool? Desk diving is a thing. People who take their submariners off to have a shower because they just never use it in that sense and don't feel comfortable with it. So it's a very, very different culture, and I think people will still want the original pieces.
And I guess the last orders, the way the Daytona, the exotic Daytona, Paul Newman, was not fashionable when it was created, and then subsequently became iconic. Is there going to be, maybe in that sense, the ultimate unknown is fashion. The cyclicality of fashion trends, and who knows what in 10 years, maybe there'll be this enormous retro demand for a very particular kind of design. Maybe PVD covered watches will be the range, who knows, more than today.
I was thinking on the train on the way in, I was thinking, wouldn't it be bizarre if something completely ridiculous happened, that suddenly men were wearing ladies' cocktail watches for some reason? It became the ultimate fashion, and you can imagine us all going, "Oh, do you remember when you could buy a Longines diamond-clad cocktail watch for the exactly?" And now it's 40,000.
Yeah, no, it's unknown, I suppose, is what.
That crystal ball, I wish I had it.
Yeah, likewise.
Okay, so what we have here is a Hoya Ortavia, currently very sought after. It's a 2446, but this one has a few interesting quirks. It's very much, I suppose, what you would call a barn find. It is largely filthy, and we did remove some of the dirt so we could check serial numbers and model numbers. Sadly, the movement is also fairly grubby, so although complete and in reasonable condition, it isn't running. But the interesting thing about this one is the dial is actually a fourth execution dial. You can spot the little red hash marks around the hour markers, and you've also got the little black inserts into the hour markers as well. But that's incorrect for this watch. So we've got the original third execution handset, and the date of the serial number would take us back to third execution cased as well, which is one of those imponderables. Was there dial damage very early in its life? It's because we bought in 68, 69, and a year later was having its dial changed as a service and therefore got the next execution of the dial? Or was it one of those on the cusp pieces where they had the new dials in, they run out of the old ones, using up the old hands? It seems a little early for that. I lean more towards the damage to the original dial and swapped in a couple of years later. But that's the great thing about vintage watches, is you don't know, all you can do is surmise. But it is a life hard lived on this one, and an honest piece for all of that.
I confess I have, this came straight off my wrist. It's my watch, but it's my by far my favourite watch of sort of choice in terms of any watch out there, really. It's a 3940G from Patek, but it's from the second half of 1989, and I think 89, the second quarter is when they first introduced the white gold variant. From recollection, 87 is when the watch came out, and whilst they've obviously reissued multiple executions of this watch with different reference numbers, the earliest pieces with the sunken subdials, with the shadows, just for me, are absolutely perfect, and the size, I think it's from recollection, it's, I should know, 36 or 37 millimeter, but it just fits perfectly on the wrist, and to have a slim white gold perpetual calendar with so much going on dial side at a time when, you know, the watchmaking industry was still somewhat unsure of itself, I think makes it an absolute classic.
So I brought along Lange & Söhne Datograph Flyback. Started production in 1999, and one of the things that I love about this is the history and the story of Lange & Söhne themselves, and the fact that they restarted themselves after the unification of Germany, but they did it in the traditional German style. So they went back to their roots, and it has an exhibition back, and the finish on the movement and the quality of the movement is absolutely sublime. It's a real collector's piece of the future.